Hi, everyone. As you can see, we are once more doing an interview. I'm very excited today to be joined by Will Murray, who is not only the co creator of Squirrel Girl, but who has also done tons of work with Doc Savage, including novels, essays, started off doing some fanzines, helped revive the spider. I'm very excited. You can tell I'm tripping over everything. Did some Tarzan work, Sherlock Holmes, everything. And I'm very excited to be chatting with him here today. So thanks so much for being able to find some time to discuss all of this with me.
Well, thank you, Sasha. I happen to be away from home, which is Boston, and I'm in New Orleans where it's snowing unexpectedly. So we have a nice snowy day to talk through.
Well, that's good. I'm very excited. Actually, we got in touch because you commented on my Squirrel Girl video because I had gotten one of the end facts wrong, and it was that I had said that it was supposed to debut in West Coast Avengers, but actually it was supposed to be an Iron Man villain story, which makes a lot more sense because Iron Man is so prominently featured inside of it. And
Mhm.
I was like, oh, it's actually him, because sometimes it's not actually the people who say that they are commenting. So, how has it been like for you seeing these big revivals and resurgences for Squirrel Girl?
Well, I will go back to the beginning
Mhm.
and not the origin. We can talk about that a little bit, but to address your question pointedly, I remember filling out the release that I have to fill out, release of rights, and having a moment of hesitation and feeling I think this character is going to be bigger than an Iron Man story, and that was an
Mhm.
intuition of which I have had many in my life. And but I went ahead and signed it and turned in the story. At that point, it may have already been penciled, and I think she was kind of a lark, although she'd been in my mind for a long time as a character, not necessarily a Marvel character. And it wasn't until they printed the book. We're talking about early 1991, but I wrote scripted the story in November of 1989. And it wasn't until I saw the printed book that I saw that the character really played. She really came across. And I got more excited about her. Not that I wasn't somewhat excited in the beginning. And I immediately pitched a one shot. Squirrel Girl tries to join the Fantastic Four, but that Marvel didn't bite.
Mhm.
And it wasn't long after that. Strange things happened. And I say strange, I don't mean weird. I mean unusual things with a newly introduced character. At that time, Marvel had a thing on the bullpen bulletins page called a coolometer, and the coolometer was a thermometer showing the favorite characters, least favorite characters, or situation. And she came in at the bottom.
Mm.
And I grumbled to my editor, and a month later, not that it's connected, she came in at the top of the coolometer. And I thought about that, and I said, anytime a character gets a strong negative and positive reaction, she's hitting buttons
Mhm.
and she has potential. Well, as I said, Marvel didn't pick up on my pitch, but they were publishing a thing called Marvel Year in Review, and for 1991 or two, there was a sort of a joke thing, Squirrel Girl 2099 or whatever it was. There was an interview with a Marvel editor now deceased, whose name is escaping me at this exact moment, but he was, a major editor for a long time. And he talked about, it might have been an interview, he talked about Squirrel Girl. He said, we love Squirrel Girl at Marvel, but she's not really a Marvel character. You're not going to see her again.
Mm.
And I thought, these guys are not getting it. They are just not getting the potential. Because at that time, there weren't a lot of female readers of any ages
Mhm.
compared to now. There's been a real change, as you witness your podcast. And I thought, this is a character with potential, but also a character that had positive potential. And I was already discouraged by that because I could feel in my bones that she had very strong potential. She was rather unique, even though you could say she's kind of a variation on Tarzan or a variation on Ant-Man, a human that can communicate with animals or insects, in this
Mhm.
case, squirrels. So in that sense, she wasn't all that original. It's just that the whole squirrel thing was completely unexploited. So, I think 12 years passed and it looked like Squirrel Girl was dead, but they revived her for Great Lakes Avengers for 4 issues, and she kind of clicked then. And at that point, I pitched another Squirrel Girl thing, and again, they didn't bite.
Hmm.
But but subsequently the Erica Henderson comic was released, and it's funny because in my pitch I called her the unbeatable Squirrel Girl because she'd
Hmm.
already had the reputation of being able to beat people that were otherwise not necessarily beatable by a character of that stature. When that comic started to hit and it became popular on its scale, it
Hmm.
wasn't Spider-Man and it wasn't Batman or X-Men, but I was invited to write a short story, and Erica Henderson scripted it for one of the issues. And then subsequently, they did 2 volumes of Marvel 2000 and 2001, and I did a one-page Squirrel Girl
Hmm.
vignette where she's up in a tree upset because the doctors have ruled her out as a mutant, and now she
Hmm.
doesn't know what she is.
Hmm.
And I thought that was, for what, given that I only had a page to work in, I thought that was a good way to do something with the character without trying to do a story in one page.
Hmm.
So, and that was the last of things I did with Squirrel Girls. I've only done 3 stories, but
Hmm.
I am not entirely surprised that she's gotten this popular because I had that intuition and it was strong. I
Hmm.
was surprised that she didn't catch on back in 1991 and that she was actually suppressed. But when she started to snowball with Great Lakes Avengers, that's when I started to get the feeling that she may be coming back in a big way, and she certainly has.
Hmm. So, what's it like now to be interacting with the fandom in that way? Because you've always been fairly heavily involved in fandom. Like, you started out doing some fanzines like Skullduggery, and I'm not sure how to pronounce the other one. Is it Duende or?
Duende, yeah, Duende is how I
Mhm,
pronounce it. Yeah, well, like so many in the industry, I'm a fan who turned professional. I mean, it's a natural progression. It's actually more unusual to be a professional writer dropping into comics out of some other environment, although that does happen. I do podcasts and
mhm,
I do conventions. I don't do a lot of conventions with the Squirrel Girl emphasis. I do pulp and paperback
mhm,
conventions because that's where my novels are. So it's fun. I like doing it, and it's redeeming in the sense that my vision for the character has finally manifested on the level that was certainly maybe more than I expected, but I didn't have specific expectations. I just knew that she had strong potential.
mhm,
So it's enjoyable when people say. I mean, I've had people say, young girls say, or young women, depending, saying, Squirrel Girl saved my life, and I understand that. I
mhm,
understand that when you're at certain ages, you can be very much unmoored or confused or lost, and if you can, and people latch on to TV shows or characters or even celebrities, and people have latched on to Squirrel Girl as inspirational. And one of the things I like to do is write about characters who, even though they express themselves in violence and action, are on some fundamental level inspirational. My thinking of Squirrel Girl is she was kind of the last Silver Age Marvel character, even though she arrived in the late Bronze Age, I guess.
mhm.
So I enjoy interaction, but of course, I'm not writing the character. I'm detached from it, except for
Mhm,
3 stories. So it there's a sort of arm's length thing here as well. I mean, I
mhm,
appreciate it and I'm glad, but it's not. I'm not. I don't guide the character's destiny.
mhm. Has she changed a lot from how you originally conceived of her?
Yeah, I conceived of her as 14, 15. And I wanted her to be prepubescent in the sense that she would be an innocent. There was a character, Kitty Pryde in X-Men, who was, a young or an older teenager, and I didn't read those books at that time, but I
Mhm,
wanted her to look at the world through more innocent eyes than Marvel characters usually did at that
mhm,
time, anyway, because it was the grim and gritty era, which has not left us. And I wanted her to be. I had 2 basic inspirations: a former girlfriend who wasn't
mhm,
14 or 15 when I knew her; she was in her 20s, but she was very young for her age and in her outlook on the world, and she was kind of innocent in some ways, wide-eyed, and kind of like a child. She had some childlike qualities, even though she was, as I say, in her I think late 20s. And Mary Martin's Peter Pan gave me some other elements. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It was on
mhm,
it was on TV a lot in the 60s and 70s and maybe the 50s, and I watched it annually. It was like The Wizard of Oz. They'd show it
mhm,
once a year as a special. And she dressed up in a Robin Hood outfit, and she was very forceful in her way.
Hmm.
And I gave Squirrel Girl some of that personality as well, in the sense that she was assertive, and when she entered a situation, unlike maybe women in comics up to a certain point, she, put her hands on her hips like
Hmm.
Superman, did the wide-legged stance and says to her squirrels, "Sick 'em," and
Yeah.
she has enormous confidence in being a superhero, or at least in those days, a fledgling superhero that I've got a costume and I've got allies and I've got powers. Of course, I'm going to win. In a
Hmm.
sense, she's oblivious to the reality of the world that sometimes the good guys don't win, but in comics they do win. They don't always win right away. So that's another long answer to a short question, but I think I answered it.
No, it's good. I like hearing all of the details. I think it's really important to preserve all of the the history and all the steps, because it's easy, like when I was researching it, it's very easy for certain things to fall by the wayside, especially on the digital space, where
Yeah,
sometimes not everything ends up being maintained in the same way as you get with the physical zines or any other kind of medium, because there tends to be a perception that digital is going to be forever. I'm like, well, only if people maintain it and archive it and all kinds of other important things.
that's right. As long as we have electricity. If we don't have
Yeah.
electricity, there's a problem. I should talk about the origin of Squirrel Girl, since
Hmm.
it's fits in with what we're discussing. I'd forgotten this. A friend reminded me of this story. As said, I had former girlfriend in the '80s named Doreen, who was into animal rescues, and among them squirrels. There were a couple things that happened, more or less, not quite parallel, but in a sequence that somehow Squirrel Girl emerged from that.
Hmm.
One of them is I would periodically have squirrels in my attic. And one of them, who I actually called Monkey Joe for some
Hmm.
strange reason, was a little fat squirrel. I don't know, male or female, I think male. And I used to feed him peanut butter. He was friendly.
Hmm.
And, sometimes the squirrels would have babies. One morning I woke up and my bedroom window was open and a whole bunch of baby squirrels were crawling around the covers,
Hmm.
which rather startled me. So I was seeing squirrels up close, and they were interesting to me. Now, Doreen, the real Doreen, used to rescue squirrels and birds and other animals, wildlife, and worked at a wildlife reclamation place or whatever it was. And when I was dating her, this would have been the '80s. Um, we went to church one day. It was
Hmm.
winter, and she was wearing a winter coat. And during the service, she kept it zipped up. And in the middle of the service, she pulled down the zipper, and a baby squirrel had poked out. I had no idea it was there. And I'm
Hmm.
looking with, great astonishment at the fact that she's been nursing this squirrel with her body warmth and carrying it around in her coat. Never mentioned it to me at all.
Hmm.
It was just matter of fact for her. And I remember when we were leaving the mass, we she stopped, and the squirrel drank some of the holy water,
Hmm.
which is not a thing squirrels are usually allowed to do. So either I or a friend of mine, when I told that story, coined the term Squirrel Girl. At that point, it was just a nickname for her, for
Hmm.
Doreen, the real Doreen. Here's where it gets fuzzy. My memory is that when Howard Mackey, the editor of Iron Man in 1989, asked me to do an Iron Man fill-in, I think I started with the idea of Iron Man versus Doctor Doom, and then to make it a non-traditional story in the sense of just not another slugfest,
Hmm.
I thought I would introduce Squirrel Girl. I thought I'd created Squirrel Girl at that time, but it turned out, greatly to my astonishment, I was writing a paperback series called The Destroyer, which became a movie. Remo Williams' The Adventure Begins in the 1980s. I had apparently mentioned her in a couple of Destroyer novels as a joke.
Hmm.
And someone found those things and put them on a website. And I read that and I said, really? I was talking about her like 5 years before? I don't
Hmm.
remember that. And I don't remember that. But apparently the idea was gestating for a long time, because in one of these Destroyer novels, It's just the name of a Ferris wheel at a amusement park, the Squirrel Girl ride. But in
Hmm.
another, these two guys who are like the Teenage Mutant Ninja creators were saying, in one vignette, we're talking about creating this character called Squirrel Girl, and they even gave her a real name. In the first story, I couldn't give her her real name. There was no room for it,
Hmm.
and no origin. It's a mystery how she got the correct real name.
Hmm.
Because when I did my Nick Fury novel Empire back in 2000, in my bio, I mentioned that I was the creator of Squirrel Girl alias Doreen Green.
Hmm.
And that was the first time Doreen Green had appeared in print. Someone picked up on that and made it official. But I had no
Hmm.
control over that. I just put that out there because that I'd already had her name in mind. I do remember when the guy, and again, I'm blanking on his name, the guy who was doing Young Warriors came up to me at a New York convention and said, I want to put Squirrel Girl in the Young Warriors. And I said, her real name is Doreen Green.
Hmm.
So just so you know. And between those two things, her real name got into the comics. But it took years. And I'm not sure how that actually happened because it was
Hmm.
not official. So somehow I turned my ex-girlfriend Doreen into Doreen Green Squirrel Girl, and I don't really remember the processes of that, except it was apparently a long evolution conceptually.
Hmm. No, that's really interesting to like learn about the name because I was wondering because there was that gap there in between where she doesn't have it and then she does. So it's just fascinating how it managed to evolve in that way. What about her look? Because you said that you would conceive of it more as a Peter Pan type look initially.
Well, in my script, I gave her this Mary Martin Peter Pan forest outfit, Robin Hood outfit, in the thinking that she'd be up in the trees a lot with the squirrels. That was actually fairly short-sighted. When the pencil pages came in,
Hmm.
Steve Ditko had drawn her completely different. And I asked him, why did you do that? He said, well, she should look like what she is. Spider-Man looks
Mm.
like Spider-Man. Squirrel Girl looks like Squirrel Girl. So she's got this outfit that looks like it was rummaged out of her mother's, wardrobe trunk. And I
Hmm.
don't know what the fur vest is. I don't know that that's real squirrel fur or it might be rabbit fur, but we don't go into those details. So I was not happy with his design, but I understand in retrospect it was appropriate because, if she's dressed up like Robin Hood, that visual doesn't quite match her name and powers. So it's fine. And then
Hmm.
over time, that outfit evolved and evolved and evolved. And I like the idea of a character having more than one outfit. And, yeah, Superman should always look like Superman. Batman can have lots of outfits. Spider-Man can have lots. There's no reason you can't have different outfits as long as the character is recognizably who they are.
Hmm. No, and especially I feel like it makes them have a level of verisimilitude because it's like people change their clothes and
Yeah,
stuff slightly all the
sure.
time. So it makes sense. And also it's a nice way to evolve them for the time. So having to do anything too massive or drastic because it feels like, especially for her, she's evolved quite nicely and naturally in that
Mm.
way for the years since she's appeared, even though there's been these big gaps, it doesn't necessarily always feel that way when one is tracking the character's evolution itself.
Oh, and she's also had many body types. And, as I
Mhm.
like to say, the Squirrel Girl that Steve Ditko drew could have grown up to be any of those body types, but not likely all of them. So we have quite a departure from body types and other aspects of her looks, but that's fine. That's
Mhm.
for the Unbeatable Squirrel Girl comic. It's more cartoony. If she's in the Avengers, it's more realistic, and that's just the way it is.
You mentioned that you feel that there is some Tarzan inside of her. Like, what is it that drew you to the pulp so much?
Um, I think I was probably 15 or so, and I was intensively reading Marvel comics as well as some
Mhm.
other comics, and I liked that stuff. And when I discovered things like Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carter of Mars, and Doc Savage, it was like getting prose versions of the things I liked in comics, those types
Mhm.
of heroes. But on a more mature level, or at least what I would perceive as a 15-year-old, a more mature level. So it was a natural progression from you can't read comics forever exclusively to what's out there that that presses the same buttons. So I got into H.P. Lovecraft and Robert Howard's Conan, and many heroes. Captain Future, the Shadow is big with me, and others less well known. The Spider, the ex-girlfriend who I'm with, her great granduncle wrote the Spider. So that's our connection. That's how we came into contact. So it's just a guy growing up and wanting to read something other than comics. And I kept reading comics for a few more years, but eventually the pulp and paperback stuff just eclipsed it all.
You've done a lot of work specifically with Doc Savage. What was it about that character specifically?
It's hard to say. I tell this story many times, and it has a kind of a spiritual or metaphysical feeling. It was a Friday night in late January 1969, and I was just starting to buy paperback books, Man from Uncle novelizations, and the early John Carter books, and some other things I was, reading just to see if I liked them or not. And I didn't have anything to read, and it was snowing lightly. And the place where I would get my paperbacks was a spinner at a drugstore that was like a mile away or something. So I felt this compulsion to walk out into the snow on this dark Friday night and go looking for something to read. And I'd seen Doc Savage books on the spinner racks before, but they struck me as maybe, because Doc was in a torn shirt, maybe the equivalent of like Men's Sweat, magazines in book form. So they never drew me. But on this particular evening, I came across Dust of Death, which showed Doc Savage juxtaposed against this hooded villain who reminded me of, Marvel Comics villains. So I bought it and I read it, and over the weekend, and by Monday morning I was in high school. When I got out of high school class that day, I went over to the bookstore near the high school and I started buying Doc Savages, and I never stopped. What appeals to me, I think what always appealed to me in characters like Superman or Captain America or Spider-Man, they're heroes, they're inspirational, they're interesting. The stories are interesting and not just the characters. And it's just the same strings were vibrating. Little did I know that buying that Doc Savage would probably completely change my life in terms of career trajectory. But in retrospect, it was like I was hearing a calling in some way, because, it wasn't normal to walk out into the snow and go that distance just because I could reread some old Marvels. I didn't need a book that night, but I just felt this compulsion to go out into the night and just pick something up, something new.
How did you start creating the fanzines?
Well, I had an idea for the first fanzine I did, Duende, and I'd gotten hooked up with a small publishing house, Odyssey Publications, that were just starting to reprint pulp magazines in trade paperback form. And I told them about my idea, and they said, well, we'll co-publish it with you, which got me to, move in a direction that wasn't what might have been otherwise mimeograph. So we did 2 issues, and the 3rd issue turned into a book, the Duende History of the Shadow magazine, which sold very well. It was a book on the Shadow, and it was kind of my magnum opus. And then we went back to normal reprints. We did chapbooks, and over time, my professional career started to take off, and Odyssey became less and less viable because it was very labor intensive in those pre-computer days to put out a book.
When you're working on Doc Savage, because you've written so many books for him, how do you find that it translates into writing for the evolving times and eras, or is that not something you consider while you're working on it?
I'm kind of a channel in the sense that I not only can write about these characters faithfully, but I can replicate the author's style, which is not something you can do mechanically. So when I'm writing a Doc Savage, I read or reread a bunch of docs, get into that mindset, and I can't read anything else fiction-wise, only nonfiction, and I just plug into that energy, whatever you want to call it, and I become Kenneth Robeson, the byline of Doc Savage. When I do the Spider, it's the same way. It's a different vocabulary, even though they were contemporary writers, they knew each other. It's the tone, the sensibility, the level of violence, and as I say, the vocabulary and the worldview is different. And it's just a matter of cramming, in rereading. and just getting into that mindset and staying there until the
Hmm.
book is done. And, I'm pretty good at staying into those mindsets. I did 40 Destroyer novels, and there were two
Hmm.
authors who originated that, and I had to kind of blend those two styles into a style. And so I'm just able to do this. It's kind of a weird talent, wild talent, but I can do it. And most people say, geez, what's with this guy? If you read my Amazon reviews, you say, he writes Tarzan like Edgar Rice Burroughs. He writes Doc Savage like Lester Dent. He writes a spider like Norval Page. Now he's writing Sherlock Holmes, and it reads like Arthur Conan Doyle.
Hmm.
What's going on here? I never talk about it. I just don't want to get into what I do on that level because people don't always resonate with that level of operation, shall we say.
Hmm. Because it sounds like it takes a lot of definitely dedication to,
Well, any novel, long or short, takes dedication.
yes.
You got to either plot it or free associate it, and you got to stay in that story for as long as it takes for the story to be done. I mean,
Hmm.
that's what makes or breaks writers. Can you finish what you start, and can you rewrite it so that it's worth reading? You know,
Hmm.
I'm lucky because I can write. I've gotten to the point in the last dozen or so years, I've written almost all of my favorite characters and done crossovers that were previously considered to be unattainable.
Hmm.
I had King Kong meet Tarzan. People were trying to do that for a long time. Nobody could
Hmm.
pull the deal together. Nobody could pitch a story that worked, even if they could pull a deal together. I had Tarzan go to Mars and meet John Carter twice. People have wanted to see that particular story for 100 years.
Hmm.
And I did one, and then I did a sequel, so I've done two. I had Doc Savage meet the Shadow twice. People have dreamed of that. Well, the same publishing company owns both characters. They've met in comic books, but they had never met in novels until I did what I did. So
Hmm.
I keep saying that it's amazing that when I revived Doc Savage under the Wild Adventures of Doc Savage banner back in 2011, I think it was, I had 8 Doc Savages I wanted to write, and that was going to be it. And suddenly I'm doing Tarzan and then the rights to King Kong. And Doc Savage met King Kong because I
Hmm.
was able to work a deal with the King Kong people. I could have Tarzan meet King Kong. And all these crossovers are
Hmm.
they were all dreams of pulp fandom for decades and decades, and in the case of Tarzan and John Carter, 100 years plus. And
Hmm.
they all just sort of fell into my lap, either by my effort or just happenstance. It's
Hmm.
very weird because, again, I had very modest ambitions, and suddenly I'm like the king of not only pulps but the king of crossover stories in the pulp world.
Which one was the one that you were most excited to do?
All the crossovers. I mean, I don't think there was one that I was more or less excited by because they all require the same level of intensity and commitment, but different writing approaches.
Hmm.
When you do a crossover, again, I think on maybe a multi-dimensional level, but when I think of a crossover, I have to figure out first whose universe it's in or whose world it is. In the case of my first Doc Savage meets the Shadow, it's actually a shadow novel when Doc Savage enters into it because
Hmm.
it's set in that early Depression world where Doc Savage didn't usually go, but the Shadow was very conversant with. So I had
Hmm.
to sort of dial Doc Savage down a little to inhabit that world. And the second one I did, it was more of a Doc Savage novel with science fiction. The Shadow had to adjust accordingly. It was subtle; not every reader would pick up on it. So, and with Tarzan and King Kong, I realized early on, even though I wanted to call the book Tarzan versus King Kong, it had to be King Kong versus Tarzan because the King Kong, it's really King Kong's story. And
Hmm.
Tarzan enters into it and does his stuff and resolves things. So you always have to, well, I always have to think on a bunch of levels in the sense, because I am trying to emulate the original writer's style. In the King Kong versus Tarzan, I wasn't emulating a writer's style. I was emulating the 1933 movie and novelization. So that's a more cinematic book. And some people didn't like it as much because it didn't have the same level of action, because it wasn't the same kind of story. Again, I've just given you a very long answer, and I'm not sure I quite hit your question, but there it is.
How did you get into writing comics?
Well, it's very simple. I was writing the Destroyer paperback series. That was 4 novels a year, and they'd been talked about licensing the character to various outfits. And one day, Warren Murphy, for whom I worked for, who was one of the co-creators of the Destroyer, called me to let me know that they'd sold the rights to Marvel, and they recommended me to write it. So I talked to Howard Mackey, who was the editor, and we came to terms. And even though I hadn't written comics before that, except maybe small stuff in fanzines, I'd done a brief strip or two. They liked my stuff, and we just rolled from there. And this was the black and white magazine, so they were originally 52-page stories, and they shrunk to 48. And I had no problem with that, because as a novelist, that's still kind of a short story to me. So it was through that door that I wrote my one Punisher story for a Punisher summer special, and the Iron Man fill-in that became the Squirrel Girl debut. They asked me if I would pitch for Doom 2099. At first I said, I don't know. And then I did, but they picked up on someone else. That was the end of my writing Marvel comics, except for the stray Squirrel Girl story. But I have written introductions to some of their masterworks.
Do you prefer prose level writing overall?
Yeah, I think, because it's all my work in comics. I like to say that in comics, the writer writes the script, but the artist tells the story for him. So the artist is the one who has the final say, and you don't always get what you want, although usually you do. I remember when Ditko's pencils for the Squirrel Girl story came in, I had a scene where Squirrel Girl had these retractable claws in the tips of her fingers, just like squirrels. And she carved a heart in the tree, and it was SP and Iron Man, Cupid kind of thing. He changed that to this knuckle spike that retracted, and I objected to that, because I thought that was a steal from Wolverine, and he wouldn't change it, and so I just let that go. But in retrospect, she can have both. There's no reason not. It's actually a good touch. I think I understand why he did that. I think the squirrel claws are just too small to show well, but the knuckle spike, you could show it clicking out and then cutting, at least I assume. But that wasn't what I wanted, but that's fine. You can still have claws.
You've been working on like these pulp characters who have been around for a while, and you're emulating these authors' styles. So do you find that there has been much of an evolution or change in the characters as you've worked on them?
No. I always say this, and I will say it again. When I write a Doc Savage novel set in 1936, I'm not writing a story set in the past. I'm putting my consciousness into 1936, and I'm trying to write a contemporary Doc Savage story. So it's a mind trick. In other words, usually when someone writes a period piece, they kind of overload it with period references. But the original novels don't have any period references other than what would naturally occur in those stories, or would naturally occur in a modern story. So that to me is always self-conscious. If you put in too much period, detail, just trying to emulate. No, I've got to write the story like it's 1936, and I understand the world I'm writing about, and I understand the characters and the context of their world. So it's the characters don't change. I've written now 22 Doc Savages, and some of them take place as early as 1934, and some of them take place as late as 1949. And the character is different in some of those years because the series has evolved. But I don't change the character. If I write a 1949 Doc Savage, he talks and acts like 1949 Doc Savage and not 1934 Doc Savage. So, that's how I approach it.
Do you find that people respond to that? Do you think that that's what they're responding to, like when you get nominated for the awards and the like?
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Again, if you're going to write an existing
Hmm.
character, you have to write it authentically. But I
Hmm.
feel on top of that, not everybody agrees, and I understand that. You, the reader who reads or rereads, and don't forget, I'm basically writing for an older audience, people who are buying these books, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, for the most part, who are essentially, these are nostalgic exercises for them. I get
Hmm.
comments like, boy, I just read your new Doc Savage. It just took me back to my grandmother's porch when I first started reading Doc Savage in 1969 or 70 or whatever. If you have a favorite TV show, especially from your childhood or young adulthood, and you rewatch it, that's like comfort food. So
Hmm.
my books are comfort food for people who were reading these books decades and decades ago, but they're also comfort food for people just discovering them and saying, I like these books. They're not excessively violent, but they're violent. They
Hmm.
don't have swearing. They don't have sex. They don't have this. They don't have that. It's true they reflect more the 20th century with the positives and negatives of that. But there are a lot of us who were born in the 20th century who are, who just say, well, that's how life was then, and that's how people thought and think. We try to avoid, racial stereotypes where we can, but
Hmm.
we don't try to apply.
Sanitize.
Well, I don't know. I think in part and parcel of being authentic is you don't try to put 21st century words, ideas into
Hmm.
20th century characters. And we see this in movies a lot where, whether it's a Civil War movie or a movie set in the 50s or 2000, whatever,
Hmm.
there's a tendency to want to make everything relatable to the audience, which is perfectly understandable. But you have people in different times espousing ideas, sensibilities, and consciousnesses
That don't
that are
fit them. Yeah.
that don't fit. I mean, in Hollywood has always done this. Most cowboy movies and TV shows, it's always been let's say 60s people pretending to be 1870s people.
Hmm.
The classic example is, in a lot of westerns, you'd have a woman in blue jeans, which would probably be highly unlikely, but not impossible. And
Hmm.
so, people would dress and act and talk from the standpoint of, um, you have to pardon my phone,
No,
uh,
it's all good.
uh, from the standpoint of the audience's point of view. Because you told a real story set in the Civil War, people are going
Hmm.
to act and talk in a way that might be actually alien to us,
Hmm.
you know. And I'm not talking about just the racism, but that too.
Hmm.
And it's I like the authenticity of reading something older and having the characters act and talk and speak the
Hmm.
way people were then, like a Sherlock Holmes story. People act.
Hmm.
The original Sherlock Holmes stories, people had the sensibilities of the Victorian era. That doesn't mean I agree with those sensibilities, but if I'm going to write a Sherlock Holmes story, and I've now written more than 50 of them, to my amazement,
Hmm.
uh, I want to be authentic, but I don't need to get into things. I don't need for anybody to be racist or sexist unnecessarily. But
Hmm.
there's a kind of sexism that was prominent in the 20th century that was kind of like this. Oh, the man is like the surrogate father, and the girl is the surrogate daughter in terms of how they interacted, and that's it's pretty harmless, but it's kind of cheesy too. So there was an editor of the pulp magazines, the Western pulp magazine. One, it's amazing what the pulps didn't like and did like. Some of them didn't like women characters at all. Some of them
Hmm.
liked them to be de-emphasized. And one editor said, if you're going to put a woman in your Western story, make her a tomboy. Make
Hmm.
her make her kind of like a variant male, and you understand why, because the pulp readers didn't necessarily want romance unless it was a romance novel, but they
Hmm.
liked a pretty girl, and they liked a feisty girl, and sometimes I liked a girl who could stand up for themselves, but mostly they were used to girls who needed to be rescued, which
Hmm.
gets really boring to a writer if the only
Hmm.
reason a girl is in a story is she needs to be rescued. So, I try to avoid that in my books, but that's a reasonable choice. So anyway, the point is, there's a kind of sexism that's kind of a mild, kind of condescending condescending attitude
Hmm.
to a male that at the time, not today, but at the time would be seen as cute, the kind of a thing you'd see in the Saturday Evening Post as well as in a pulp magazine. And if I write a story with a female character, and except with certain exceptions, like Pat Savage, Doc Savage's cousin, who was
Hmm.
pretty well stood up to herself pretty strongly, but still got that kind of condescending treatment. You're a girl, you shouldn't be coming along on our adventures. I mean,
Hmm.
that's what my readers expect. So that's why I wrote a Pat Savage novel, so she would have his or her
Yeah.
own adventure. And and one of Doc's assistants, Monk Mayfair, he's the sidekick to her in this book. So I reversed those roles.
Hmm.
But it goes back to saying, if you're going to plug into the consciousness of the original writer or the consciousness of the series,
Hmm.
you've got to be reasonably faithful without necessarily replicating the warts.
That's personally something I look for when I am going for like works that are emulating classic works, because I have read some of your Sherlock Holmes works, and that's one of the things that I appreciate about them, because there have been a lot of extra stories told outside of Conan Doyle, and sometimes they can veer quite heavily, and that doesn't mean
Well,
that they're not still
no,
fun to read
I mean they're
sometimes,
not
but it's
at
just that it's
all.
not what you're looking for, you know?
But for those who love Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, reading my stories is a reasonable substitute, because the rhythms are the same, the dialogue is similar, the sensibilities are the same, and the character relationships are the
Hmm.
same. I like to give Watson more credit and more to do in my stories than making him a bumbler. You know,
Hmm.
when I can use him medically, I will. And I recently wrote one where Sherlock Holmes falls ill and he doesn't know what's going on and he may be dying. And it's up to Watson to figure it out, because Holmes is too sick to do the
Hmm.
mental process necessary to figure out, have I been poisoned? Have I gotten a disease? I have all these
Hmm.
symptoms. They don't point in one direction. And it's Watson who does the investigation and Watson who carries it. And I like that, because Watson was a medical guy. By our
Hmm.
standards, he was primitive, but by those standards, he was a respected, intelligent, educated person. So I like giving Watson some authority in the stories and something to do other than to be astounded by Sherlock Holmes.
Which is really interesting, because when you have all the adaptations, they can kind of morph together in a way, and kind of over time really shift a character in a different direction than from where they originally started, because there have been so many Watsons and so many
Yeah,
different like takes on Watson at this point, especially just because there have been so many takes on Sherlock as well. Bringing it back to fandom, because I obviously find fandom quite fascinating. I've built a whole channel around basically being a fan. What are some changes, if any, that you've noticed in the fandom space? Because you too started out like in it as well.
well, this is something I thought about a lot. I started buying comics the Christmas vacation of 1961, and I read comics pretty intensively through about 1973, and never really stopped completely, but slowed down a
Mhm.
lot. And when obviously that was pretty much a male thing, except for the romance comics and maybe some outliers. And when I became a professional, I was writing novels. I was covering films for Starlog and Fangoria and going around the world being on movie sets. And I was immersed in a whole bunches in writing for fanzines as well as semi-professional magazines. And I was immersed in multiple fandoms. And I
Mhm.
was extremely busy and still am. And over the decades, a shift had begun that I didn't notice at the time, but one day I woke up to it. And the
Mhm.
two things I noticed that I thought were startling and intriguing and good were that the stuff I loved, the popular fiction stuff in the broadest sense, had become
Mhm.
the center of world culture and not just some niche over there
Mhm.
or some corner over there. And when Marvel Comics movies happened, and people started taking the pulps more seriously, and the creators more seriously, and when people started to want to know the background of their TV shows or their favorite movies, and not just go to the movie or watch the show and okay, that was good. They
Hmm.
really wanted to know, how was this created? Who created it? How does this happen? So people had moved from just being passive uh, consumers of popular culture to actively interested in the machinery behind the scenes.
Hmm.
And the other thing I noticed, and it was over time, I remember in the 70s, Wendy Pini would come to conventions dressed as Red Sonja, and that was an unusual thing at that time. And more as time passed, other women would show up at conventions doing cosplay.
Hmm.
I think when it hit me, I was at a pharmacy getting a prescription filled, and the two women behind the counter, they were young, probably early 20s. And one of them just casually said to the other, Green Lantern is my favorite superhero. And it hit me that I would never have heard that. A girl say that, a young
Hmm.
woman say that, back when I was buying Green Lantern, or back even in the 80s, probably, that somehow women got into comics on a level beyond the romance comics, which I don't even think hardly exist anymore, but into the superhero comics. And that was a sea change. And it was happening sort of where I was, when I was immersed in everything and not paying attention, did I
Hmm.
realize that suddenly women were big consumers of all comics,
Hmm.
potentially. And that's big. And that was one of the reasons I thought Squirrel Girl had potential, because I thought she would have an appeal to an audience that Marvel at that time wasn't accessing on the level they access now. X-Men, I think, sold to a lot of female and male readers, pretty much, not equally, but in pretty good proportions to one another.
Hmm.
And that was a breakthrough. And I thought there was a potential for Squirrel Girl to appeal to maybe a slightly younger audience, in terms of she's younger and she would have different kinds of adventures, the adventures of an innocent,
Hmm.
which is a kind of a storyteller thing that, it always had an appeal, like the country guy who comes to the city and everything is amazing to him until he starts figuring things out and gets used to it. Squirrel Girl
Hmm.
would encounter things that would be, because she's 15, she'd react differently than, Captain America or Spider-Man, who were older and, more worldly. There
Hmm.
used to be a comic I liked that was not a traditional superhero comic, Little Archie. It was
Hmm.
about Archie Andrews when he was just, 8, 9, 10 or something, pretty young. And as Squirrel Girl took off a little bit, I thought keeping her at 15, 14 and having her have backyard adventures like Little Archie could be an interesting book, because it could be an entry level book for
Hmm.
young Marvel readers, the way Casper the Friendly Ghost or Wendy the Good Little Witch used to be. Because
Hmm.
some kids, their earliest comics weren't superhero stuff; it was the cartoon stuff, the animated stuff.
Hmm.
And I don't know if there's a market for the backyard adventures of Squirrel Girl, but I think she would have her own friends. She would be learning about herself and about the squirrel world, you know,
Hmm.
and it would be a different setting than these giant universe spanning adventures everybody else goes on.
I definitely think that there is an appeal there. I agree with you entirely because when I was doing the editing on the Squirrel Girl video, my daughter happened to wander in and she was just like, "Oh, who is that? Like, she's cute. Like, she looks fun." And she's 7 and she has had this instant kind of reaction to it of like, "Oh, that looks like it would be fun." And then it's like, "Well, I need to see if the adventures are appropriate. Hold on. Like, I need to go and
Yeah.
check before."
A funny story is when Unbeatable Squirrel Girl came out, the real Doreen,
Mhm.
when brought, she works in a comic shop, by the way. And
Mhm.
so, I hadn't seen her in many years, and she popped up at my local comic shop behind the counter and like, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I work here." So I told her about Squirrel Girl, which may or may not have been published that time, and she thought I was joking. She
Mhm.
didn't realize till much later that I really modeled a character after her. She took home an early issue of Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, and her mother saw it, and what's that? And she
Mhm.
said, Squirrel Girl. It was made based on me. And her mother said, no, it's not. And, and Doreen at that time would have been in her 40s, 50s probably. Um, and the mother looked it up online and saw that, who she hadn't seen in many moons, in
Hmm.
fact, had created a Marvel character, based on her daughter. And, I never did talk to her about it. Um, but, that was kind of an interesting experience for me because when I was dating Doreen, I was much younger. I was in my
Hmm.
20s. I was trying to be a writer, and their parents didn't look very favorably upon that because they thought I should get a real job, like so many
Hmm.
people thought. So not only did I redeem myself, but in fact, Doreen's father loves my Sherlock Holmes books. He
Hmm.
buys every one of them. So I kind of redeemed myself in that sense a little later
Hmm.
than maybe it might have been useful to do, but that's life.
It's really interesting you mentioned that because it shows that there's this generational aspect to fandom that I feel has also really grown over time of people sharing these things and it becoming more passed down. Like you were speaking of it becoming more of a cultural center and moving outside of that niche. I feel like that's part of also what's happening with the expanding of fandom in that it's no longer something you kind of hide. Like I have this whole room and everything, and like the kids come in and it just becomes kind of part of the fabric of
Yeah,
everything.
yeah, it's an amazing evolution, and I've been privileged to watch it from, like I said, I was, if I started buying Marvel comics in late 1969, I was almost on the ground floor of their evolution.
Mhm.
I missed the first three Fantastic Fours, and that was it. I came in
Mhm.
with number four and Hulk one and stuff like that. So I saw this evolution over time, and I interviewed a lot of Marvel and other comics professionals. So I got to interview them and work with them. When I worked on the Destroyer, I worked with Ditko,
Mhm.
Don Heck, and many others who were, who I was reading when I was like 8. So it
Mhm.
was quite a thrill. But it's a pervasive thing, and it's unstoppable. I mean, but before that, if you look at the first maybe 7 decades of the 20th centuries, it was almost all westerns. Westerns
Mhm.
were the superheroes at that time. It was, and people would go through evolutions. We're sick of the westerns, now we want them
Yeah.
back. And they're different kind of, they're singing cowboys, and then serious westerns, and then Lone Ranger type of kiddie westerns. But the
Mhm.
the western seemed unstoppable, and then it sort of collapsed. And now
Mhm.
superheroes have taken its place, and I guess science fiction has taken its place to some degree. But it's a remarkable thing, and I wonder how long it will last. I don't see any reason for it stopping, but obviously heroes do get overexposed, and but every generation should have their Superman and their Batman, cinematically speaking. I
Mhm.
feel, and for that new generation, it's like, okay, this is my Superman. Uh,
Mhm.
but it's an amazing thing to have seen it, not only seen it evolve, but become a part of it on so many different levels. I really have a
Mhm.
weird career in the fact that I've been a journalist, a novelist, a comics writer, and academic. And to some degree, I've written a lot of scholarly articles on not only the Pulps but H.P. Lovecraft and other
Mhm.
writers of that era.
How do you find interacting with all of the technology that's come out? Because when I found that it was actually you and I went to check you out on Twitter and stuff, I saw you had all of like the fan art that was coming your way and all of that. So what's that been like?
The my Twitter now X feed is
Yes.
a lot of Squirrel Girl stuff, and I always like and share it. Um,
Mhm.
I don't always necessarily interact with it because how much can you say past a certain point? Yeah, years ago, maybe 10 years ago, when Squirrel Girl cosplay started to take off, uh,
Mhm.
I used to joke that if every girl or woman who dressed up like Squirrel Girl could be assembled in one place, I could probably conquer a small country like Bolivia. And now it's grown exponentially. Uh, and I go to conventions, and I will encounter someone dressed as Squirrel Girl. Sometimes they're very young, and sometimes they're more mature. But I
Mhm.
remember the first time I was at a convention and someone showed up as Squirrel Girl. She never came to my table, even though I had a big Squirrel Girl banner. And I'm thinking, what's up with that? You know?
Sometimes people are too shy. I've definitely had that moment at cons of just like, walking back and forth and then
Yeah,
being
yeah,
too nervous to actually approach the
that
person.
might be.
What's your favorite part of the con experience?
Well, when I go to conventions, I do, sometimes I'm invited to panels. That's
Mhm.
always interesting. I usually do them without any preparation because I've done maybe
Mhm.
hundreds of panels in 50 years. I like sitting at a table and selling my books and getting
Mhm.
feedback. I used to like meeting the people who I grew up on, but there's hardly any of them left.
Mhm.
So and now there was a time for a long time where I knew that at least the names and styles of every comic book artist out there. Now it's just a bewildering constellation of people who I've never heard of, and I don't recognize necessarily their styles except for the occasional, um, someone who stands out like Alex Ross or someone like that.
Mhm.
But so, I don't connect on it. I don't connect with the talent as I used to because I'm on their level in a different way. But also, I just not reading the stuff the way I used to. I can't keep
Mhm.
up with it. I'm always glad I stopped collecting comics intensively in the early 70s because if I kept going, it would have cost a fortune. I think I'd have
Yeah.
burnt out.
What are some of the things that you do keep up with?
Well, actually, there isn't anything right now. Squirrel
Mhm.
Girl was the last thing I bought regularly. And I wasn't even reading it that often because I'm almost always in the middle of writing a novel. I got to have the consciousness. And also
Mhm.
because I'm older, if I read a comic in January and the next issue is in March or even February, I'm not likely to remember it because in between I've done so much stuff that
Mhm.
my head just can't get plugged back into it. I've become
Mhm.
so much more of a creator than a consumer. It's hard for me to sit down even to read a novel. I can read novels if they're they pertain to what I'm writing for
Mhm.
research. But I just I'll start a novel or something and I just get the itch to go to the computer and start writing. It's like I got to be
Mhm.
producing stuff. That's what I do. And when you've consumed as as much stuff as I have, it's hard to find things that really grab you. Like I
Mhm.
stopped watching TV a long time ago because it just wasn't holding my attention. And I haven't been to a movie since, which is strange because I covered the film industry. I haven't been to a movie since COVID started.
Mhm.
I just fell out of the habit once COVID became less of an issue.
Mhm.
So I'm trying to think if there's anything that I've been reading that I've even sampled recently, and there isn't. And I think Squirrel Girl is the last thing I bought regularly. Squirrel Girl, anything with Squirrel Girl, I'll buy,
Mhm.
obviously. But before that, and we may be going back a while because I
Mhm.
stopped. I would use for a long time. I'd buy anything Steve Ditko drew, and
Mhm.
sometimes if Jack Kirby drew it, but otherwise no. And I'm more inclined to buy reprints of things that either I once had or never had than
Mhm.
than anything new because comics now are for generations that are very much removed from my generation and my sensibilities. Hence, the fact that I tend to write 1930s and 40s pulp fiction when I'm not writing Victorian era fiction.
Mhm.
So, comics have changed a lot in the sense how the storytelling is, and it isn't necessarily the stories aren't as meaty to me in terms of the things I've skimmed. It's
Mhm.
like they're little flashes of a story that accumulate into a story. And I'd really rather read them all at once or not read them at all because I just can't hold these stories in my head because I'm writing my own stories.
Mhm. There definitely is a lot of what they call, like, decompressed storytelling or writing for the trade that occurs now, so it is like I'm also a person who likes to trade wait, as they say,
Mm.
just for when everything's all also then because it's nicely bound and with the kids around, like, the floppies, I'm always just concerned that something's going to end up happening to them, they're gonna get torn or something like that. But are you working on a novel right now?
Yeah, I started something unusual. I got the rights to a pulp character named Dr. Death. And
Okay.
Dr. Death was a kind of cliche mad scientist, but what was interesting about him is not only did he have scientific adventures, but he controlled supernatural creatures like zombies and elementals.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a public domain character I'd never written before, Secret Agent X, who
Mm-hmm.
tended to investigate things that had a horror taint to them,
Mm-hmm.
but he never encountered the supernatural. So what I've done is I've put him in a situation where he's dealing with Dr. Death and his zombies, which is way outside of his previous experience and maybe outside of his league. So he has to assemble other heroes to help him because his primary
Mm-hmm.
gifts are changes of disguise, a gas gun, and certain kind of gadgets like Doc Savage had. And so he tangles with Dr. Death and realizes deep into the book, you know what? I can't do this alone.
Mm-hmm.
So I've done something really unusual. I've made it clear that the hero realizes he can't defeat this guy on his own
Mm-hmm.
terms. He's got to bring in others. So he brings in other characters that had previously been published. So I assembled kind of a miniature Justice League of America of pulp heroes.
Mm-hmm.
I have another collection of Sherlock Holmes stories that I'm assembling. I have a Tarzan novel I'm supposed to write. Beyond, and I have another nonfiction book on the Shadow that's being assembled now. And those are my
Mm-hmm.
4 projects right now, my main projects.
How long does it generally take you to write a novel?
It varies. Sometimes sometimes I will get in a flow and turn out a book, a draft of a book in a month or so. But sometimes like with the Secret Agent X, I wrote 20 chapters and I brought the story to a certain point and I realized I need to really think through the rest of it to make all these jigsaw pieces work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll get back to that. In my Destroyer days, it was typically 6 weeks,
Oh, wow.
and that's multiple drafts. But
Mm-hmm.
then I was writing on a computer. Now I dictate onto my iPad, transfer it to my Mac, and rewrite it to death to get it up to a professional level.
Mm-hmm.
But I like to stay with the book until it's done, but it's not always possible since I write so many other things and there are other demands on my time.
No, it sounds like you're quite prolific.
I think I've done about 90 books if you count novels and nonfiction books, give or take. I'm not sure. So that's a lot
Mm-hmm.
by itself. And I wrote for Starlog magazine for probably 25 plus years. And I wasn't in every issue, but I was often in most issues and sometimes in the issues more than once, as well as in
Mm-hmm.
Fangoria and satellite magazines like the Star
Mm-hmm.
Trek magazines.
Mm-hmm.
And I still write for either fanzines or semi-professional magazines when I have something to say and there's an opening.
Mm-hmm.
So I've written an enormous amount of stuff.
No, that's really awesome. And I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to discuss it with me. And I'm sure all of the viewers are going to be really interested to hear about it. So thank you so much. And let me leave any of your stuff or info of how they can reach you if they're interested.
Well, my website, where I sell my books, is www.adventuresinbronze.com. Adventuresinbronze.com. And of course, my books are also available on Amazon and on Kindle and Nook
Mm-hmm.
as well, most of them anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So you can check me out on Amazon. You can check me out on adventuresinbronze.com.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. This was fun.
Thanks so much to everyone who made it to the end. Share all your thoughts on Squirrel Girl and pulp novels and all of that good stuff. Thanks again to Will Murray for taking some time out of his day to discuss all of this with us. And of course, as always, there'll be more videos coming soon. I'll see you there. Bye-bye.